thank you, Arthur, for organizing this great conference. I'm learning a lot, and I think it's great to have this forum to talk about photography of all kinds. I'm going to start here in the present, but then quickly go back into the past for a bit of a history lesson that I think is relevant to a lot of the issues involved in photography and truth today. You may remember in January, Nancy Pelosi's office released this photograph of the Democratic women of Congress who had just been elected on the steps of the Capitol. And there was some controversy about it because a few of the women who are in the picture were not there when the picture was taken. They were late for the photo session and were added in Photoshop. This was acknowledged, with the picture when it was sent out to news organizations, but nevertheless, some people were disturbed by this manipulation of an official photograph. So when Pelosi had a news conference, a reporter asked her, what do you think? Is this picture, an accurate record of what happened that day? And her response was, quote, "It was an accurate historical record of who the Democratic women of Congress are. It is also an accurate record that it was freezing cold and our members had been waiting a long time for everyone to arrive. It wasn't like they had the rest of the day to stand there." So that's what happened. These congresswomen were late, and so they were added into the picture afterwards. Now, the National Press Photographers Association and the White House News Photographers Association didn't buy Pelosi's line about this. They disputed it, and they called the photograph, quote, "an example of the dangers in using a manipulated official photograph, thus undermining the public's trust in visual images." And some people even went so far as to compare it to Soviet propaganda of the Stalin era, in which Communist Party officials who had fallen out of favor or been killed were removed from official photographs. So this is a picture of Stalin with Nikolai Yezhov, who was the head of his secret police and was sort of one of the masterminds of the purges of the late 30s until he became a victim of the purges himself and was tortured and killed and then removed from the photograph when it was republished in 1940. So that's this is a famous example of politically motivated manipulation of images. I don't know if it's quite what Pelosi is doing, but there is a very important question about photographic truth and that this example brings up. The Press Photographers Association is saying that a photograph can only be true if it represents a single moment in time, one single moment in time and space, that these people were on these steps during this millisecond in which the picture was taken. Pelosi is saying that the photograph is true because it accurately represents all the members of a given group at a particular moment in history. So we're talking about two different ideas of the span of time that a photograph covers in its truth. And a really different idea of moment, whether is it the millisecond that the camera's shutter opens, or is it the historical moment that this group of elected officials represent. Now, there are precedents in the history of photography for these different ideas of photographic truth. This is a picture from 1865 by Matthew Brady. It was taken at the very end of the Civil War in Washington, D.C., when all of the troops came to basically celebrate the end of the war. And Brady had asked Sherman and his chiefs of staff if he could photograph them together for a group portrait, and they agreed, and so they made a time for them to all show up at Brady's studio in Washington, D.C., and they, were ready to pose for the portrait, except one of the generals was late. And so they waited around, and Brady told this story. They waited and waited, and finally they're like, "Look, we want to go home and see our families. We've been at war for 5 years," and so Brady went ahead and took the picture. So this is the picture that he took, and then later, a few hours later, the other generals showed up, and Brady added him into the picture using pre-Photoshop techniques. And so this is a photograph that is exactly the same idea as the women, Democratic women of Congress. It's showing a particular group of people, all of the members of this group together. It doesn't represent a single moment in time, it represents a single moment in history. Now, we'll go back a couple of years before this and look at what was going on in terms of the illustrated press at this time. Now, halftone printing, which allows you to easily and mechanically reproduce photographs in print and the printed page alongside text, was invented in the late 19th century and really only took hold in the early 20th century. So before this, news images were either drawn by hand by sketch artists who would go to the scene of the event, make sketches, take notes, and then go back to the newspaper or magazine office and create a sketch, a drawing that would then be turned into a wood engraving and printed in a newspaper or magazine. Now, sometimes sketch artists based their images, their drawings, on photographs. Okay, so here is an example of, on the left is Matthew Brady's photograph of the residence of John Burns at Gettysburg. John Burns was a Civil War hero. He was an elderly veteran of the Spanish-American War who ran out and joined the troops at Gettysburg and fought heroically and was wounded and really became a very popular figure, in part thanks to Brady's photographs. Now, when this photograph was reproduced in Harper's Weekly magazine, they couldn't make a halftone, so they had a sketch artist, a wood engraver, copy it, and so what you see on the right is the image that appeared in the pages of the magazine. And we can look a little closer at Matthew Brady's original image. John Brown is the guy, he's sitting there, John Burns is sitting in the doorway with some crutches leaning up against the wall of his house. His wife is standing there behind him, and in the foreground is just this sort of rutted dirt road with rocks, and shows the house and architecture, but it's not a very dynamic or interesting picture. And part of that is, Brady wasn't there when John Burns had his heroic return from the battlefield. He just, found him and made a portrait of him. Now, the artist who translated the photograph into publishable form, animated it, and really, depicted the moment that Brady didn't capture, which was the moment of the homecoming, where you see him in the wagon, being taken out of the wagon. You see people from the town running to greet him, and he's no longer in the doorway, although his wife is still up there on the porch. So here, there's a very interesting idea of photographic truth. The caption says, photographed by Brady, so it is important that this is from a photograph, and people did appreciate the exactitude and the documentary authority of photography at this time in the 1860s, but what was more important was the demand for lively, legible, visually engaging illustrations that conformed to existing pictorial and narrative conventions. This is idea that this is what the homecoming would have looked like had Brady been there, although even if he had been there, his camera was too slow to capture all this action, so it probably would have been just a static image anyway and would have had to be changed when it was translated. So this is just sort of looking at how the standards of photographic truth in journalism have changed over the years. Now, we're going forward now about 35, 40 years to the early 20th century. This is a cover of the New York World Sunday magazine from 1901. And that year they ran a series called Photo Scenes from Real Life, which showed ordinary New Yorkers or famous people in various locations in the city. It was a very, very hot summer, and so a lot of people were going out to Coney Island at night. There was no air conditioning to enjoy the sea breezes. And so this is a scene of people, all kinds of different types, out at night at Coney Island. Now, some of these elements are photographic, but other elements, like the background, are drawn. They're not photographs, and these are combined in this very vibrant hodgepodge that is kind of half fact and half fiction. It was the caption, which we can look a little bit closer at. It says, "An actual scene at Ocean's Edge." Now, and then it continues, we're thousands, blah, blah, blah. Now, this was an actual scene by 1901 standards, in the same way that a newspaper's sketch artist's drawing from memory was actual. It was a nonfiction recreation, but not a direct reproduction of a single moment. This was not a single moment. It was many different photographs that were pasted together to create this overall impression of the scene at Coney Island that night. So the photographic standards, partly because of the technology of reproducing photographs, were always changing. They still are changing today as our technology of both photography and printed reproduction of photographs changes. Now, another example. Here is a picture by Horace Nichols. He belonged to the first generation of photojournalists in England in the early 20th century. And like many of photographers of this generation, he was really more interested in producing meaningful representations of events rather than capturing a fragment of reality. He freelanced for dozens of newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, The Tatler, the Illustrated London News, and he specialized in scenes of Edwardian high society, going to sporting events and society events and things like that. So this is a picture of the Epsom Downs on Derby Day, or Derby Day, as the English say, it's a scene with lots and lots, big crowds, everybody's holding an umbrella, it's raining. Now, this was not exactly what Nichols saw. On the left is closer to what the original picture was, although I think he actually pasted in the figures at the bottom. And then he cloned some crowds, pieces of the crowd holding umbrellas, and just filled in the empty space on the racetrack to make it really look as crowded as it felt to him. And he talked about how he just couldn't get the impression that he wanted with a single negative, and he felt like, well, painters add things in all the time from different moments, and so that really should be okay for photographers to do as well. And this would not have been printed with a caption that says the image had been altered. It just would have been presented as it is, as a news illustration of this day at the Derby. Now, this idea of a photograph as an illustration rather than an eyewitness report persisted through the early 20th century. And it was things like this were being published, in the mid 50s. This is a news photograph from the San Francisco Examiner archive, and it's a form called the photo illustration, photo diagram that the Examiner used very often to illustrate crime or accident scenes, especially scenes where a photographer wasn't present when the event happened. You can't get a picture if there's no photographer there. Before cell phone cameras, there often wasn't a photographer there when a car accident happened. So they would take a scene, a photograph of the actual street or location where the event happened, and then using collage and hand drawing would sort of draw in a narrative of this event. So here you see a car careening down the street of a hill in San Francisco, and there's an X marks the spot where a pedestrian was hit, and then the car careens into the wall of a building. Now, this kind of picture doesn't have the immediacy of eyewitness photojournalism, where you actually see the wrecked car or the mangled body of the victim, but it's a pictorial hybrid that does have certain advantages. The photo diagram can effectively communicate a complex narrative that no single straight photograph could ever encapsulate. And this kind of photo illustration represents a different kind of photographic truth that's been part of the tradition of photojournalism since the 19th century. Now, it's only really been in the second half of the 20th century that standards have been, the current standards for photographic truth in newspapers and magazines have been codified in the way that we know them. This idea that a photograph must represent a single fragment of time. And obviously, this idea of photographic truth is what upset people about Pelosi's picture. I want to just bring up this issue of whether we still need this idea of photographic truth as a single moment, a single millisecond, or if we might be able to embrace this idea of photo illustration in the digital age. And of course, we can talk more about what this means in terms of photographic evidence, but I will say that as Lewis Hine once said, cameras can't lie, but liars can photograph. We can no longer, we never really could look to the camera as a guarantee of photographic truth. Photographic truth has always been an interpersonal relationship. It's a relationship between the person who is making or distributing the photograph and the person who is looking at it. And it's that relationship that guarantees truth, not the existence of a camera as a mechanical apparatus for capturing a fragment of reality. So now I'm going to let Fred, wherever he is, come up and talk, and we will probably disagree vehemently, and so I hope it will be an exciting discussion.
Okay, thank you to Mia and to Arthur very much. I'm sort of not going to show images. I'm not going to show images. The reason I'm not going to show images in a way is because there's like a tendency with cell phones and things that if you don't have an image of the event never happened. And so I'm hoping that you think this event never happened because there'll be no images of it, kind of a thing. So we could sort of just think about things as opposed to trying to solidify things. I think what I'm talking about is kind of what are we talking about when we're talking about photography? because I don't think we really know what we're talking about when we're talking about photography, because photography mutates and becomes lots of different things. For me, the beginning of the digital revolution started in 1982 when National Geographic moved the pyramids on the cover, which everybody could imagine the image at this point, yes? There's two pyramids next to each other on the cover of National Geographic. And what they did was they had a horizontal photograph, and it didn't fit on the cover. The cover's vertical, so they had to move the pyramid on the left behind the pyramid on the right to fit the vertical. And National Geographic at that time, if you had a black and white portfolio, wouldn't look at you. They were just Kodachrome. They made fun of you because they're elite and you weren't at their level, and so on and so forth. They were kind of the arbiters of they held the tradition in a way. And Bob Gilkes spoke about that a year or two later about what they'd done, and he referred to it as like limited nuclear warfare. There ain't none, because once you sort of let the cat out of the bag, you can't put it back in again. Once you start manipulating, you can't do it. So I called the editor-in-chief and I said, why did you do that? And he said, it's really nothing. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a few feet to one side to get a different point of view. So that way he was looking from this side instead of straight on, and the pyramid would be behind the other pyramid. And I thought that was a really interesting answer, that National Geographic could go back in time and move a photographer. Because National Geographic was very conservative, but they were kind of into what most people think of as sort of science fiction at that point. And I remember saying, I think it was Bouba, the French street photographer, and telling him about that in Paris, and he turned all white, pale white, and started sweating because he felt all that time he waited for the little girl to cross the street with flowers and the taxi and the snow. They could go back in time and move him. And so his images, which he thought of as fixed because he was in his 70s and his career was ending, we could all go back in time and move them around and remake his images. And I said they would never do that to you, they only do it in color, because I felt bad for him because he worked in black and white and he felt much better at that time. So to me, that's like one of the bookends. That's where the digital revolution started, but we didn't acknowledge it at that time. Those were Cytex machines. They cost $500,000. There was no Photoshop for another 8 years. But that was already happening. And, as Mia pointed out, it's been happening since the very beginning of photography, that we've manipulated images, we've set up images as photo illustrations. If I wanted to ask you all to look happy and then we make the picture, this is a great lecture because we illustrate the idea that you're all happy. So we're certainly interpreting. What I've always thought of photography is as a quotation from appearances. That's it. It's kind of a recording device that quotes from appearances, just like the way the writer quotes. And we know that the writer makes up quotes, and we know the writer changes quotes. But when I started my career was in the early 70s at Time Life Books. We were working on a book, and I met the writer, and he was really shaken, and I said, what's the matter? He said, I don't have one intact sentence from the entire book that I wrote because the editors have edited and re-edited my sentences, so there's not one sentence that I wrote that remains in the book as I wrote it. And so I switched to the side of pictures because I didn't want to be on the text side anymore, because I kind of believe that the voice of the author should be respected. And I knew if there was a photograph, we couldn't go in it and change the commas and semicolons like you can in text. You sort of have to run the picture. You could crop it, you could miscaption it, you could run the wrong picture. But if you were devious enough, sometimes the right picture would get published. That was sort of the idea. So that's where it comes from back there. But more recently, to me, the end of the era of even attempting to think of photography as credible in the sense as being automatically a quotation from appearances, or at least perceiving it for the most part as that, was when Osama bin Laden was killed. Because at that point, he was the #1 most wanted guy on the American most wanted list for all those years, and finally they killed the guy. But they refused to release any imagery of the killing, which is unusual because usually when you kill the #1 enemy, you want everybody to know we got the guy. And there were two reasons that the White House said that they refused to release it. One was because they didn't want to enrage much of the world that would be enraged by seeing him with bullets in his head shot up and so on and so forth. But the second reason the White House gave was no one was going to believe it anyway. Because the perception of photography is that it's highly manipulable. Anybody can manipulate it. There's selfies on Facebook where you could manipulate yourself to look the way you want. When I was a picture editor had to do with selecting images. Now editing has to do with manipulating images. An editing tool, you manipulate the images. So it's back where I started in my career, where the pictures were sort of sacrosanct in the sense you couldn't go inside it. Now everybody could go inside the images, and they're made for post-production. You could do things to it all the time. So the assumption then that we would not release the images because the White House was saying nobody would believe it, to me was a major moment, because no longer was photography viewed as a credible medium, as an automatic quotation from appearances. So what photography has become, to me, is rhetorical, just like writing. Like, you don't believe words just because they're words, right? But it depends how they're put together, who says them, when they say it, and how they say it, that you believe the words. It's the same thing with photographs. I don't believe 90% of the so-called photographs that I see online. I just don't believe them. I think that they're made up. I think that they're manipulated. I think that people are doing it for a certain purpose. I don't think it's the actual personality of the person being shown. I think the higher up they are in terms of celebrityhood and power, the least likely it has any resemblance to who they are. And I think we've all copied that all the way through. And I think also subjects have gotten incredibly good at manipulating photographs. I just wrote a book, which I am now prompted by Aperture to hold up. It's called Bending the Frame. It's coming out next month. This is the first copy. And the point of the book really is to say that the frame is bent. The whole thing is bent. The whole system doesn't work anymore at this point. And one of the things I wrote about in Sierra Leone, which I find very interesting, was you remember many people in Sierra Leone during the war there had their hands cut off. You remember those images, and they're terrifying images. They're horrible images. So there's a journalist, Linda Pullman, who went and she interviewed the guerrilla leaders who now wanted to be the chauffeurs for the NGOs because they signed the peace treaty, and since they were the leaders of the one side, they wanted prestigious positions. They wanted to be chauffeurs. So they were asked, why did you cut off the hands of those people? You cut off a lot of people's hands. What's the point? And they said, we did it for you. And she said, she's from Holland. She said, why did you do it for us? And they said, because you wouldn't have paid any attention to us unless we cut off people's hands, because then you had good photographs and video of us, and all you guys could then get engaged with us and give us money and intervene and do these things. So you needed us to cut people's hands off for your images. So the subjects were using the press for their own benefit. And I find that more and more happens, that subjects of all kinds use photographers and imagery for their own benefits. So the manipulation isn't just from the powerful down anymore. It's everybody's manipulating in all kinds of ways if they know how to manipulate the image. And it's accepted that way, just the way everybody manipulates words. I'm doing it right now. I'm manipulating words, so hopefully you'll either agree with me or disagree with me, or we'll discuss it. But these are my words, and it's as authentic as I am at this point. And I think photographs is the same way. It's as authentic as the maker of the photograph is, in terms of the way you perceive it and look at it, and it's no longer automatically credible. The closest you'll get to credibility is bringing in the photographer, bringing in the subjects, bringing in everybody who will vouch that the photograph was something like the way it looked, but it's not anymore that kind of vehicle in the world. What bothered me when I started writing about this, I started writing about this in 1984 for the New York Times Magazine, was the powerful people. It doesn't bother the powerful people that nobody believes the pictures. But if you're starving from hunger right now, and there was 1 million of you starving from hunger, and a photographer came and took pictures hoping there would be aid, and nobody believed the picture, the people without the power have a lot to lose from the press, from the media, from the photograph, from the credibility, whereas the people with the power are reassured because we don't have to believe that they're starving anyway. The photograph isn't credible. It doesn't really matter. They're there, and we're here, and we're okay, and we'll discuss Facebook. But we don't have to discuss the rest of the world. We could just leave it out because there's no credibility anymore to the evidence. So we've sort of established for ourselves a cocoon, and the cocoon, we kind of like the cocoon because we can't be troubled by it. We could always say it didn't happen, it's not there. So the question then is, what do we do at this point? Because I don't think any of us would believe it's a fair kind of system where the rest of the world is easily excluded because we don't believe they're there, kind of a thing. So the reason I wrote this book, and the reason I've been thinking about it, is that I don't think the old models work anymore. I think, many people think photojournalism doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people have promoted it to visual journalism, which is a much broader sense of it. And we know that things that are visual are not automatically credible. They're just visual. Paintings are visual. They're not automatically credible. Data can be made visual, and so on. So what do you do with all this stuff that's visual? You have to figure out ways to do it. Do you give the cameras to the kids who live there and they make the pictures because that's more credible because the kids made the pictures? Is that one system? Do you use Google Street Views, for example, because that's just this like car going by with a machine, and there's no subjective photographer, making the images, just a subjective car making the images. And then you look at it, and the artist of the year this year for ICP, the artist of the year, the Infinity Awards this spring, is somebody using Google Street Views. They're photographing the screen. And in some ways, the Google Street View has much more credibility, to me at least, at this point, than a lot of conventional photography does. One of the questions I asked in the book, and you'll have to stop me if I'm not good at 10-minute things. So, what was really that if a 20-year-old person came up to you and said, I want to be a photographer of war, there's about 800 or 1,200 books on photography of war. It's a big thing. But if a 20-year-old person came up and said, there's a revolution going on, there's a digital revolution, there's a whole new media, I want to now be a photographer of peace. There's no books on photography of peace. It doesn't exist as a genre. There's no exhibitions of photography of peace. So the questions I'm trying to figure out are, if this whole system doesn't work anymore, like Mia pointed out, there's the people in Congress and so on. The one when they killed Osama bin Laden, you remember all the Obama watching and all the cabinet people watching these screens as they were killing Osama bin Laden far away. When that ran in Orthodox Jewish newspapers in Israel, they knocked out all the women because you don't publish women in pictures in their newspapers. So we're doing this all over the place. I don't believe this system works anymore. So the question is, what new systems do we come up with? And I think it's our obligation, it's our responsibility at this point to figure out what are the new systems. And that's why I'm asking the question, what are we talking about when we're talking about photography? Because I think if we're talking about a photography that we think of as automatically credible, that doesn't exist anymore. It really doesn't exist. It exists maybe among your friends. Like you get married and you show your friends, I got married, and they know you, and you're an authentic source. That's okay. 20 years ago, a friend of mine did wedding photographs in which he put everybody as the honored guests of the bride and groom. They all got to be next to the bride and groom because he just used Photoshop and shuffled them around. That was in Switzerland 20 years ago. But if you get it from the bride and groom who then maybe you'll believe it. It becomes more like local things and community things, and oral traditions work better than these other kinds of traditions. So to me, really, am I 10 minutes? Yes, I am 10 minutes. So I'll leave it at that. But the question to me, really, for me, what I think about all the time is how do we reinvent the stuff that we used to use it better, to do what we want from it, not what the manufacturers give us. Just because it's called an apple, doesn't mean it fell from a tree. It doesn't mean it's a source of knowledge. It's a machine. And how do we want to use these machines to get where we want to go? And, the major question is, where do we want to go, as a society? From the previous discussion, I don't want to be in a place where Aperture publishes my book and everybody downloads it for free, so Aperture could never publish another book. I think we're required to buy books. I think we're required to pay for things, intellectual content, to each other, to pay, to be citizens in that sense, to help support these moving forward. And, but we have to have a vision, where do we want to go, and then how do we create media that helps us get there? So to me, we're in this area, what people call the previous book I wrote was called After Photography, because it was based on the idea that the old sort of semi-credible photography quotation from appearances doesn't exist. So where do we go now? Where do we want to go? And thank you very much.
Okay, so just to follow up on what you're saying, I agree that we can no longer look to the camera or to photography itself as a guarantee of truth. But you're saying that we can only believe in the truth if it's a close community connection. If we're looking at the wedding photographs from the bride and groom and we know that they are honest enough not to have manipulated them, why can't that interpersonal relationship be extended to news organizations the way that we do for any other kind of news report? That we will, say, okay, if the New York Times publishes this photograph, we have their word that it was not manipulated and therefore can believe that it represents what they say it does.
I think there's a few issues. One is I don't think the New York Times exists anymore the way the New York Times used to exist, like the paper version. The head of intellectual property of the United Nations just recently announced that he thinks by 2017 there'll be no print newspapers left in this country. The average age reader of the New York Times print 4 or 5 years ago was 55. So that's an entity, the New York Times, and if you buy that New York Times and you're part of that system, but now the New York Times on the web sort of semi-exists, but you're getting in there from Google, you're getting there all kinds of different ways, and it sort of mixes up. But I think what the New York Times is doing, which is very smart, is if people saw Watching Syria's War from the New York Times, for example, the argument there is 28 journalists were killed in Syria. It's very difficult to work in Syria, and they have to depend upon videos and photographs coming out from Syria. And what they're trying to do is crowdsource now the imagery and try to figure it out if it's fabricated, because otherwise you don't know. I went to a conference recently, which was one of the most terrible things I've seen. It was a woman in a burqa, completely dressed, holding a Quran, and talking in Arabic about how she was raped in Syria. It was just horrible, horrible, horrible. And the woman who presented it, who works for a group of women journalists, said at the end, we don't know if this is true. Like this could have been completely fabricated by the rebels to show how terrible the governments are, and there's no way we could really tell it's true. And meanwhile, I was like sobbing in my seat, and then she's saying, but don't respond to it because we don't know if it's true. So I think what the New York Times is trying to do is try to use citizen journalists, try to use advocates and try to figure out what's going on from them, and they're not sure what's going on from them. That's one reason. But the other reason is I think that one question to ask is what's the difference now between a professional photojournalist and an amateur? And very few people can answer that question at this point. We know that the amateur journalist has equipment that's very, very good, that they're ubiquitous, that they're better, they speak the language better, they're more involved in the culture, they more understand what happens in daily life. And I'll give you just one example. In Arles 2 summers ago, there was a guy from Tunisia talking about, he was a computer programmer during the revolution, the Arab Spring, and he said the way he worked versus a professional was that he didn't frame the image. He used a cell phone because if he framed, he would be arrested. The security forces would arrest him, so he didn't have time to frame. If somebody got shot, a neighbor got shot, he would pick them up and bring them to the hospital. And if 400 people came to the demonstration, he would caption it 1,500 people because he wanted everybody to join the revolution. So that was his sort of ethical background. And he said the professional would wait for somebody to get shot and make the picture because they'd get the front page because somebody got shot. So his investment was nobody to get shot and the revolution to be won, and the professional was waiting for somebody to get shot. And then when the professional asked the question to the police of how many people are at the demonstration, they would say 25 because they want the revolution to fail. So everybody's subjective all around. So what I'm trying to say, a long way about, is I think I have more faith in a lot of citizen journalism at this point because they know the culture. In Egypt, for example, I don't know if you know this, but one of the heroes of the revolution in Egypt was a guy whose eye was shot out by the police because they aimed at people's eyes in the demonstrations. And at the first big demonstration, he had an eye patch. So people started showing up at demonstrations with eye patches. And then they put eye patches on statues. And then the second big demonstration, he lost his other eye. He was shot out both eyes by the police. And in Egypt, when you look at Egyptian citizen journalism, it's filled with eye patches and people's eyes shot out. When you look at the international press, they're not aware of it because that's not their culture. So that's my long answer to your short question as to why it's very difficult to believe in the press at this point, knowing that there's so many other perspectives and so many other ideas about what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point that citizen journalism is changing the landscape of, photography in the news and as well as reporting, and definitely does complicate things in terms of guaranteeing the truth of what.
But if you have 1,000 let's say something happened here and the ceiling fell down and 80 of you photographed it, you could compare the 80 photographs and see if you're all sort of seeing more or less the same thing. So you can. Citizen journalism is good for that. But I think what more and more people have to do is figure out how to filter all that and make it useful. It's in this book I wrote, I call it like we need more meta photographers than photographers, meaning we need more people who could filter all the billions of images, contextualize them, put it together. We have a lot of photographers. We could always use some more, but we also need people to filter all this and make sense of it. So, you know, there's a way to know what's going on.
But how would that meta photography work? I mean, who would be making these decisions or validating images? I mean,
there's a company, for example, called Storyful now, based in England, and that's what they do. They authenticate images. So what they'll do is, like they showed an example where during Hurricane Sandy, somebody's tree fell down in their yard, and they photographed from the kitchen. They made a video. It was like a 15-year-old boy, and it was a very popular video. And they used GPS systems and Google Street Maps and all that to find out, was the tree actually there, you know, the day before, you know, and so on and so forth, to see if it happened during that hurricane. And what they do is they sort of troll the web for those interesting things, but then they figure out ways to authenticate it in different ways. And there's lots and lots of ways to do that. But for the most part, we don't make the effort to do it. We just sort of say, oh, that's you know, the cat somersaulted, that's a nice picture, but we don't really try to go beyond that.
what do you think about the photographs from Guantanamo? Those seemed to be believable to many people. They were not professional photojournalism. They were not exactly citizen photojournalism either, but they did provide, some kind of evidence that most people, I think, found believable, that was not in the interest of the people who hold power to have disseminated.
You're talking about Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo?
Abu Ghraib, both Abu Ghraib, and also images that have come out of Guantanamo.
You see, professional magazine and newspaper journalism has a style to it, and people adhere to this style. It has to look a certain way. And in a way, we've often thought that to be a good thing, because in part, when you sell a magazine, you want it to be entertaining, you want the colors to be good, you want it to be sharp, you want all those things. But actually, that style of photography is the least credible in many, many ways now, because people see it as a corporate manipulation. It's kind of a manipulation, by the power, whatever the power is, to show things in a certain way. So the fact that Abu Ghraib pictures looked like party pictures had a greater credibility, because obviously they didn't seem to be wanting to influence opinion. It wasn't kind of a propaganda thing, and just the opposite. And so or Neda Sultan in Iran and so on, those kinds of images have a spontaneity to them, a rawness to them that's different. You could also obviously manipulate that. Governments could fabricate cell phone images to show that they're great or to show whatever they want. But we're getting better at tracing it back and figuring out if it's fabricated or not at this point. So, that's why I think really, it's a chapter in the book I wrote. If you remember the new journalism, Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese and all that, I've always felt there's been a new photojournalism, like in the 60s and 70s, like Avedon's The Family for Rolling Stone, and Perez's Telex Iran, and Dipardon's Correspondance New-Yorkaise, and so on and so forth, where people are very first person. They say, this is what I believe, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I had for dinner, this is what I saw. And so they're bringing themselves into the picture, into the image. They're not pretending to be third person disconnected and objective and neutral, and so on. And sometimes I think those things are much more credible at this point, where, it's like John Stanmeyer worked in Sudan, and, about malaria and people being very sick. And then he had an Instagram following of 500,000 people. Like, what did he have? What was he doing day by day there? And so I think there's a believability when you go direct to people and you don't go through the corporate filter, too. And so my argument is that we need many, many more of those filters. We need, like, if all of us in the room were like trusted sources for each other and we could depend upon each other and we tell each other what's happening, to me that would be great. Because you don't need like a degree to if you're Italian and you tell us what's happening in Italy, I'd love to hear it. That's why we did at Aperture a year and a half ago What Matters Now, which was trying to reinvent the front page, which was the idea that if we just all told each other what was going on in our areas of expertise, it would be really helpful. And my idea was that if 100,000 people joined that circle and we each paid $5 a month, we'd have $500,000 a month to assign new work. You know, let's say we wanted a painter to go to the Arctic and paint the glaciers melting. We'd be able to give the painter $20,000 and give other people stuff to do it. Because I really believe, going back to the Facebook conversation, nothing is for free. If anybody's giving you something for free, it's not for free. You're stuck in a system, and I'm maybe old school or whatever the school is, but I kind of really believe that if you pay for it, and it's open and above board, and you pay for it, and you know what you want to get, and you are a shareholder, and you could demand certain things, like the painter went to the Arctic, and he goofed off, fire the painter. Don't work with that painter, but get what you want in terms of learning about the world, as opposed to assuming they're all going to give it to you free, and then and then feeling somehow cheated by it. That's my sense of it.
Do you want to open it up for questions?
Sure.
Why don't we?
So I would love to hear you two argue a little bit more, rather than answering questions. I think that the Faking It show really sort of opens up the idea that old school means manipulation as much as it means anything else. So my question is, in Rebecca Solnit's wonderful book about Muybridge, she said the idea of what photography was in the 19th century wasn't even fixed. It was all things to everyone. In Henry Peach Robinson's book on pictorialism, he's arguing against people who are already mad that he was making composite images. So when was it that this idea of photography as truth came to be the anthropologically accepted predominant concept?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that. That really began I think, in the early 20th century with the rise of social documentary photography. People like Jacob Riis, Louis Hine, and others who were using the camera to try to bring social conditions to light. At the same time, there was, in the art domain, the straight photography movement, starting with Alfred Stieglitz, Paul Strand, Edward Weston, and other photographers who were defining photography in modernist terms as a straight, unmanipulated image from a full negative with no cropping and minimal darkroom manipulation as the sort of epitome of what art photography can and should be. So these two things, and then there was also the rise of photojournalism, and finally the ability to reproduce photographs in halftone, which, as I said, took hold in the early 20th century and really spread to most newspapers were reproducing actual photographs rather than drawings based upon them. So all of these different cultural currents came together to create this idea of photography as evidence and as truth that came from the mechanism of the camera. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that this idea is historically brief, that it persisted through most of the 20th century. By the 1980s, with the rise of digital processing and Cytex machines that Fred mentioned, and the National Geographic scandal and postmodernism, it's already beginning to die out, and people are becoming more and more skeptical in the same way that people in the 1860s were when they looked at a photograph. So I think that I think that's really the sort of historical trajectory of this idea of photography, and it's a moment in the medium's history that is ending, but I think that it's not what photography always was.
Yeah, to me, let me put it. I'm not really interested in photography. Let me put it that way. I'm interested in what photography can do in the world, in some sense, and I think like Mia said, there have been periods where photographs have had a credibility to them that's been really useful. The Doctors Without Borders, when they were founded, They said they would never trust an eyewitness. They couldn't convince anybody of a massacre, but a photograph would convince people there was a massacre. But the eyewitness wouldn't, because the eyewitness was considered too implicated, too subjective, and so on, and not trustworthy. So as a tool to help us understand that a massacre occurred, for example, it's been very useful to know those things. But we pretty much have abandoned that idea of usefulness. But if you look at it as a currency, if somebody gave you, a $100 bill or transferred $500,000 to your bank account, we kind of believe it. We kind of believe that the $100 bill is a $100 bill, and there's lots of ways of verifying it, and lots of ways of substantiating it. But we don't want to do that with photography. We wanted to disconnect from that kind of recording quotation from appearances, because we're not really interested in knowing what's going on. And I think it's partly postmodern. I think it's partly consumerism. I think it's partly the idea in a consumerist society you want to get what you want to get, and the society promises you can get it. And I think we want disbelief in many, many ways. We don't want to know what's happening. So I don't have, let me just finish. I don't have any argument with Mia. I mean, we're not going to engage in an argument. We agree. But I'm just trying to get to the place where, when I was a picture editor of the New York Times, for example, of the Sunday magazine, if we wanted to retouch a color print, we'd have to send it out to a retoucher. It would normally take 3 days. It would cost, in today's money, probably about $1,200 to do it, and it would be incredibly obvious what they did in the retouching, because we tried it a few times. So we didn't do that because it was too expensive and so on. Not that they wouldn't have done it. Some of them would have loved to do it. But now with Photoshop, the assumption is once it's on the screen, it's there for post-production. You could do things to it. And I remember I was on another conference when the picture editor of one of the major news magazines was there, and a guy who runs a digital photo lab stood up and he says, "Could you just tell me how far I can go before it's too far for your magazine? This is a news magazine. Like I have all these clients who want me to change everything, and what are the boundaries?" And she said, "I know it when I see it." And I was trying to think, like, you couldn't say that with a $100 bill. Like, how far can you go and it's too far? I know it when I see it. You need to know it. But I don't think we're engaged in that question of wanting the photograph to be that. We want it to be something that's manipulatable. So, the short answer is that, I agree with Mia that in the modern 20th century, as a mass production medium, it wasn't just a local kind of thing where you did somebody's portrait and they could look at it and see if it looks like them. It had a different currency to it, and then it faded away in recent years.
Well, I don't agree that people don't want to believe in photographs. I think that people very much still do want to believe in photographs, and that's why there are still controversies about adding a few members of Congress who are late to a photo shoot, into a picture. I think people want to believe in photographic truth, and that's why this idea that the camera can guarantee truth has persisted for so long. I don't think that people want truth to be malleable and want photographs to be manipulated. I think they recognize that they are, and in a way that's a very good thing because they always have been. And the sort of willful, refusal to think that photographs, can lie, has been a problem in the 20th century because it makes people more susceptible to photographic propaganda from all different kinds of sources. That I think it's a healthy civic thing to be skeptical about the photographic image.
But I think the photograph you showed was true of the Congress. I think they were the members of Congress. I feel that was a very truthful image. I don't think it was, as you pointed out, it wasn't all of them together at a second, but if a caption said, here's the members of Congress, in 2013 or whatever it is, and, some of them were there and some of them weren't there, fine. But I think it was a true image. So I think there's a place for what you might call synthetic photography, where you add stuff together, which can be truer than the one not. Like Philip Jones, if you make us, sometimes people get shot in wars, but you don't see the generals who command, like the drones, for example. You know, there are people in Colorado who are killing people in the Middle East. So you see the people killed in the Middle East, but you don't see the people in Colorado. I'd have no problem with like a collage synthesis of the people killing and the people killed in one image. And I think that's truer than just showing the people killed. But I think that's just the problem with Photoshop and all that is people do it to deceive. The problem, Hartfield didn't do it to deceive in the 1930s. Photo collages don't do it to deceive. They just say, here's the people in the drones, you know, there and there, and you put them together, and you don't pretend they're in the same place, but they're the same image. It's the issue of intending to deceive, intending, you know, to pretend that, you know, there are 800,000 people in this room when there weren't. But if I made a collage and I just added, you know, another 700,000 people who look all the same, I think it'd be a great image. But I'm not intending to deceive, and I think there's a difference there. So,
isn't one way to look at this, or one of the parts of the problem, that with photographs, aside from all the other perspectives you're talking about the lighting, about how much you can see, about the cropping, that the main thing we've come to or rely on and value in it is the temporal nature. And so going to that congressional photograph, not wanting to focus on that one just for the minute, the problem is that it is not that moment, just as Mia said. And the reason that seems so important to us is because we can't concentrate over long periods of time. Our memories are very flawed. We can't remember what happened here and there. We can't hold all those images in our head. And so with photography, it may be falling apart now, but that's the most important thing that the photograph offers me. All the rest I can make adjustments for. They may not be perfect, and I may be wrong about them anyhow, about the lighting and about the intention of the photographer and everything else, but at least the temporal nature is something that we thought we understood. The shutter opens and closes.
yeah, but the problem with that is we don't see in 125ths of seconds people. I mean, Rodin said all photographs are lies, the sculptor, because time is continuous, and photography fragmented time. So photography created a kind of a different perception that we now rely on. But by relying on that kind of perception, we view it as some sort of a truth because it's so short. I mean, computers are now nanoseconds, billionths of a second, so 125th of a second is a very long duration now. We have different ideas of fragmentation. And for me, it's meaningless whether they were all standing there that fraction of a second or whether they are added together or not, because I don't see anything in the image that makes me feel them standing together is a big deal. It doesn't really matter. Whereas if a guy is shooting somebody, they're both at the same time, that's a big deal. So
For example, if there was some court case and it turned out that one of those congresswomen was a driver of a car, drunk driving, right? And she said, "Oh no, I was standing in front of the Capitol. Here's a photograph, and we know when it was taken." That's the type of temporal reliance I'm talking about.
Unless it said this is a synthetic photograph that's put together, the caption, then she can't use that defense.
If that's the caption.
Yeah, but that should be the caption. I mean, because why I started this talk saying, what are we talking about when we're talking about photography? I'm not talking about what you're talking about. I'm talking about synthetic photography, like, you know, Pedro Mayer did the thing where he made a photograph of him as the father of his son and him as the son of his father, and he put them all together in one picture. I find that really interesting. If Pedro Mayer pretended that he could be 6 years old and 60 years old simultaneously, that would be dangerous. But if it says at the bottom, that's what it is. It's a very interesting synthetic photograph. Photographs don't have to all be analytic. As Mia pointed out, they've never been all analytic. Many have been composited and synthetic. It's a question, is it truth in advertising? Do we tell people that? That's what I mean. Some are meant to deceive, but if you're explicit and open, I don't see any problem with it.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Yeah. You said there's no credibility with the evidence, which I totally agree. We were basically relating to facts. What I'm interested in is identities. And you mentioned it, saying you basically said powerful people can alterate their identity so that they always look gorgeous, right? I have the impression that nowadays, basically almost everyone can do this through their whole social network experience. So, as you said, we need to create a new way of understanding how photography works. I feel like, and I don't know if you agree, we also need to create a new way to understand how identity works, because I don't feel I know exactly who the people, my friends or acquaintances are, you know, because I just filter them through my Instagram feed or whatever. So, and actually it's not a thing that only, as it was before, powerful people or media people can do. Because before it was a matter of the media. This is the image, the media sells the image, and this is what it's important. But now it's a matter of everyone is able to use this media, and it's a social media, and I can access it. But at the same time, I can modify my image, not necessarily with Photoshop or filters or whatever. It's just a more kind of philosophical, you know, stream of images that I give of myself. So it's not probably a question. It's more of a...
No, I agree with you, but I think the key word is branding. Somewhere in there, that everybody believes they have to brand themselves. I mean, I've been reading how war photographers need to brand themselves and so on and so forth. I used to think war photographers used to have to depict war, you know, and interpret it for us, not to brand themselves. So somehow the messenger is bigger than the message, and that's what we believe. So maybe it's time for, you know, a kind of honest photography movement or something like that, where people try to get at who they are and hope their friends will try to get at who they are and try to push it through. But we cannot have the movement if we don't even have the thought. You know, if we don't even think there's anything wrong with exactly what you're describing. Most people think it's a great thing. I could brand myself, you know, I could look hip, I could look this, I could look that. But I think the point is there any incentive not to brand yourself, to be different, to be idiosyncratic, to be vulnerable, to take risks, and so on and so forth? And I think that's what it is to be human for me, and that's what we've lost. So I think that, you know, for the most part, you could argue, I would argue, that at this point, images are concealment, not exposure at this point. We use them to conceal, not to expose. And we can change that quite easily by doing it differently if we want to change it, but that's up to us.
Mia, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has always been photographic retouching. Anyone who walked into a photo studio from 1850 onward could have their image retouched to make themselves look more beautiful and to change their hairstyle and to make them thinner. That's not new. What's new is that people have access to the tools to do it themselves. But people have always used photography for self-fashioning, to create an ideal identity. I just don't think it's a new issue. I mean, and I don't think that that branding is a new issue either. I mean, these are all things that have been part of our culture for a long time, and they're important issues to work out, but I just don't think that they're specific to the digital age in the way that people seem to believe. I mean, this is our age, and of course there are issues for us, but that's not new. Yeah.
Before, if I would have a picture retouched and my hair is in a better way, only my close circle of friends would be able to reach it. I'm not saying it's a new issue. Of course it's not. But the media we use are new. Right now, I can access 10,000 people through my Instagram profile, and if I retouch a picture and somehow that it's gonna work. Or if not, there is the possibility I can access 10,000, 100,000. And this was not possible in 1850, you know what I mean?
I guess, but who is going to be looking at the pictures of you? I mean, that's, yes, you can disseminate them,
possibly.
but who's going to look at them? I mean,
there
are now
this is the point, I don't even know exactly. But 10,000 people are looking at them, right now, I'm honest. Mm-hmm. And I have friends that have 150,000,
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they don't even know who are they. This is exactly what the issue is about.
Yeah, no, I mean,
but they can drive their audiences because they brand themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that the means of dissemination of images, that is a major change in the digital world. I just don't think that the manipulation of the image itself is something that's
Let me just say, when I was a picture of the New York Times, the magazine, I assigned Gilles Perez to photograph. There was coaches for politicians for the first time. They told them to wear blue shirts and red ties on television because they were all dressed in gray suits, and they looked terrible on color television. So they had all these coaching in different motels. They would coach them on what to wear and how to look and so on and so forth. It became part of the style. I think the Nixon-Kennedy debate of 1960, where Nixon won on the radio and Kennedy won on TV, had a lot to do with the idea that people have to have a sense of their visual impact and so on and so forth. So, I agree that people did go for retouchers or whatever they'd go to, but I think it's so, it's a question of scale. It's just all over the place. So I think it was Wim Wenders, who said that photographs can make us blind at this point, because you look at so many and they just are so disconnected from what's out there on purpose. People are trying to do it so you could manipulate just as well as any magazine could manipulate, because you know how to do it. So it's always been seeds and streams, but I think it's reached an enormous torrent of stuff.
We'll squeeze in one more question from.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to register a doubt about the brand of being human and or being authentic. But I wanted to also pick up on the idea of, because I'm not sure it has that much traction any longer, but I do think that the analogy with currency and photography is really great. I mean, we went off the gold standard, and we've now gone off the reality standard, it seems. And one of the things that says or suggests, to connect to the prior panel, is that photography has become a means of circulation and a means of production. I mean, it's a currency in itself, right? And as you suggested, it's a form of rhetoric, most certainly, with a whole panoply of interests sort of coursing through and beyond every image interface or exchange. And I just wanted to say something about the meta program of these photographs, which do function very much like money, or perhaps like capital in the case of Facebook, for example, where no matter what we do with these photographs, given the systems of distribution, no matter what we try to say, we're actually creating value for shareholders, right? Not necessarily ourselves, but there's another system in place which turns our life processes and our exchanges into a kind of value which has a power over us in a way, and results precisely in the kinds of inequalities that you were discussing, where you do have unbelievable poverty, and an image of that poverty doesn't even matter. In fact, if you control the distribution systems, then you can actually create images of poverty as if they were threat, right, or terrorist, or et cetera, et cetera.
Agree.
Okay. Thank you, Mia and Fred. Thank you very much.